Good morning. It's a real honor and privilege to be here this morning, not only standing on a Keswick platform, but also talking about a subject that I love so dearly. So thank you for coming. You're a real encouragement. Some of you were here a long time ago. I don't know what's happened to my screen here. I'm just going to whiz back. So you're a real encouragement coming because it tells me that you care deeply about children. And that is an enormous encouragement. So we're going to journey through quite a few things today. I'll explain in a minute. There are going to be resources available for you to download. And they are all next door to my left. You'll need your camera, or there's two young gentlemen on my left who will help you if you get stuck. And worst case, we can take an email address if we need to. So today we're going to journey through two or three areas of, in essence, children and adolescents. That's our focus today. But we're going to also just consider one or two things from God's word as well. But let me just tell you 30 seconds about me. So I've spent the last 35 years working with children. And I love it more today than I did 35 years ago. There's just something special about journeying with children and their families. So at the heart of me is someone who cares about the well-being and spiritual development of children. So if you were to snap me in half, then that's what you'd find. And hopefully you'll just get a little sense of my heart today as I share one or two things, both professionally but also spiritually with you. So James has very helpfully explained the question system. So let's just have a look at the agenda. This is what we're going to try and get through in the next 45 minutes to then leave some time for questions at the end. And I guess the first thing I want to do is just put a biblical framework in place for us to just think about, well, where is God in this? Then we're going to spend a significant amount of time thinking about how minds think. Because with children, that's where it often goes wrong. And then also, if you were in the tent last night, you'll have heard me say that recent research is showing that there could be 6 children in every classroom suffering some form of kind of debilitating anxiety today in the United Kingdom. Now that's horrendous. And in some cases, that anxiety kind of almost robs them of their childhood, which is a real concern, I'm sure, to yourselves and to myself. And then lastly, we'll go through some kind of top tips. And I've got some resources that you can download that expand a little bit of what I'm going to say this morning. So you can take that back to your homes or back to your churches and then use those resources. So let's get going. Let's think about the brain for a second, because in a minute I'm going to share some verses from the Bible. But let's just think about what God does as a creative God. So your brain, believe it or not, will have 100 billion neurons that then all connect together to make approximately 100 trillion connections. Now, a worm, not that many of you study worms, I don't. A worm just needs over 300 to live. And yet you've got 100 billion. And that just shows the kind of creative nature that we have, worshipping a living, creative God. Now, these two little individuals, believe it or not, they also have 100, when they're born, they have approximately 100 billion neurons in their brain. But here's the key part. They have very few connections. And they're almost making 500 million connections every minute as their brain starts developing from birth. Some of those connections they made in the womb. Now, forgive me if I get a little enthusiastic about brains and about brain research. But as a Christian, I just find that phenomenal. But the point here is, those children in many ways are a blank canvas. They've got the infrastructure in place, created by a creator God. But what they don't have are all the connections that their lifetime is going to make. Now, people like myself are losing those connections. My brain is like a lump of concrete compared to these two individuals. But God cares about how our minds work. God talks about, in the Bible, God talks about that we've got to guard our hearts and our minds. That in Romans 12, we're promised that our minds can be transformed. We're also told that our minds are either driven by flesh or by the Spirit. And what I want us to think about today, particularly for those of you who are parents, is how is your child's mind being shaped? And what's shaping it? And who's shaping it? Because the younger they are, the more of a blank canvas they are, ready to absorb and take in information. And as they do that, that's where some of those thinking patterns that I referred to earlier start to take shape. And we rely on a God, don't we, who, and I love this verse, the peace of God which transcends all understanding will guard our hearts and minds. And I think that's a prayer we can pray, can't we, for our children. And if you're not doing that already, then pray that God will guard their hearts and minds. And therefore, what you're feeding your children, we're going to look at a little later. So that was just as a way of introduction. I just thought it's nice just to ground us all in God's word before we then start unraveling things, perhaps in a bit more detail. So let's think about the emotional and thinking minds of children. Now, I want to celebrate the fact that human beings are emotional. Some of you are more emotional than the person sat next to you, and that might frustrate you. Some of you are less emotional than the person sat next to you, and that too might frustrate you. But God has given us emotions, and we should celebrate those emotions. And let's not get too concerned when children then express some of those emotions. Of course, there's going to be times when they're sad. That's natural, and we should accept that, and we should comfort and love them during times of sadness. But we shouldn't be then rushing off to try and get professional help just because there's a sense of sadness because they've lost one of their friends or their pet guinea pig has died or whatever it may be. So normal, healthy life exposes us to events that will affect us emotionally, both good and bad. Now, however, there are some times where things may get a little bit more concerning. And I've got some examples in a second to share with you. But where those difficult emotions are lasting longer. So as a child psychologist, what I care about is the emotion normal, given the event that's happened? And will that emotion come back down again to normal levels? Or does it go higher than it should? Or does it go longer than it should? And that's where people like myself would get concerned. But I'm not here to try and turn you into child psychologists. You're either professionals, grandparents, parents, aunts and uncles, and your job is to love them. Our job is to try and help diagnose them. But the point I'm making is sometimes things will go a little bit longer than perhaps it should. And that's maybe when we should start asking questions. Maybe not asking them questions, but just perhaps keeping an eye on things and just observing things a little bit more detail. Now, when things get much worse, where things are going on for weeks, if not months, then absolutely that's when you as a parent should be concerned. So if they're refusing to go to school, or they're not eating, or they're not getting out of their beds, then that's a difference between kind of an acceptable childhood wobble and something that you should be more concerned about. In many cases, this is what it probably looks like, where actually those emotions are much more suppressed and much more at the lower end of the scale, and there isn't evidence that they are themselves, they're doing what they would normally do. So here's some kind of things to look out for in those three categories. I'm not going to read all of this slide, but I just want to focus specifically on the red slide, that the three or four things that we're looking out for are often kind of physical things. So has their sleep patterns changed? Have their eating patterns changed? And has their physical activity changed? But also, have they lost interest in things that they used to do? And if those 3 or 4 criteria are being met over several weeks, then that is then a difference between a childhood wobble, and whereas a professional, I think it's wholly appropriate that you should be concerned, and maybe then start asking questions. Should we try and talk to somebody about what we're actually observing here? And because the thing with children, the question in my mind that I'm often asking is, the presentation that I'm seeing from a child, is that debilitating? Is it affecting their life negatively? And what's important in life? Education, social interaction, physical interaction. So if it's starting to affect them in those categories, and life is now much less healthy and productive in those categories, then you'd get concern from someone like myself. Now, I'm not going to repeat what I did last week because it's online and it's on YouTube's, but I just wanted to show you a quick illustration. And if you want more detail, then it's on last week's YouTube. And there's just 2 or 3 slides that I just want to recap from last week. And this slide, in essence, shows you, this is for all human beings, not just children, that at the top we think, we all have emotions, and we do things. And the story last week, what we said is, if your thinking is helpful, chances are that will trigger positive emotions. Chances are that will lead you to doing things that are good for you. Conversely, the reverse is true. If our thinking is unhelpful, chances are that will affect our emotions in an unhelpful way, and it will encourage us to do things that are not good for us or avoid doing things that are good. I'm not going to say any more today on that. The other one that we bumped into last week, which I think is really important, especially as parents, and I'm guilty of this, is we focus on the behavior that they are the things that we can see that are above the line. Whereas I believe fundamentally when we're seeing behavior we don't like, the questions we should be asking are about the things under the line. More on last week's video. And then lastly, this is something which I've seen in the 35 years I've been working with children. I see a huge impact on their emotional literacy, their emotional intelligence, than 20, 30 years ago. So let me just briefly explain what that means. Is I am an emotional being and I have emotions, but do I have the ability to label my emotions? Do I know the difference between happiness and sadness? If suddenly I start crying, do I know why I'm crying? So that's the first factor in emotional literacy. The second one is, my 2 sons are here on the left. I know how they affect me emotionally. That's the second part. So they will do things that affect me emotionally. And it'll be no surprise to you that some of those things will affect my unhelpful emotions. But they're good boys, or men, I should call them men. They also do things that affect me positively. But the same is true. So not only do I affect them emotionally, they affect me emotionally, and that's the circle. And what I'm finding more and more with children, especially boys, is they can't even do one of these three, never mind all three. And how are you going to engage with them at an emotional level if they can't engage with themselves emotionally? And the most common thing I probably say to parents is when your children are struggling, you want to know what's going on. Well, what's wrong? Who's upset you? And often the children don't know. They genuinely don't know. So they will say, I don't know. And you think they're hiding the truth from you. So what do? You ask the same question, but in a different way. And the poor child's brain is processing it, thinking, well, that's just the same question. And the answer's the same. I don't know. You get frustrated, they get frustrated. The point I'm saying is, they often genuinely don't know. Because if they can't do this, how would they know? How do they join all these dots together? More on last week's video. But let's talk about thinking, because that's really what I want to get onto today. So we talked about the mind. We've talked about those little babies, 100 billion neurons, and they're about to develop 100 trillion neurological connections. And that's really how the brain works. We need those neurological in order to, did I lose on my back? Yeah. In order to just do life. And therefore, as a blank canvas, the way in which and the environment in which they live is going to have an enormous impact on how that brain thinks. So let's think about thinking. You cannot stop yourself having a thought. A thought will pop in your head out of nowhere. And you can't stop. Have you ever tried to stop yourself from thinking? It's impossible, isn't it? And thousands of thoughts that you have each day, they're not important. They don't have an impact on you and your life and your journey of the day. So you've all put some shoes on today, I hope. Until I've just mentioned your shoes, you've probably not even thought about, did I put the right shoes on? And because so much of our thinking, we can kind of call it neutral, has no real impact. You've chosen to sit down in a chair. You're probably not wishing. Maybe those on the cheap seats are wishing that they'd come earlier and got one of these seats. I don't know. But let's think about some other types of thinking. A thought might come into your brain that you cannot control. You can't stop it. But let's pretend for a second that's a nice thought. It's a helpful thought. It's an encouraging thought. And at that point, you now do have some control as to what happens next. Because the chances are, if that nice thought has come in, someone gives you a present. And that instantly will trigger a nice thought. But then your brain is starting to think, oh, I wonder what's in this box. Then I hope it might be this. I hope it might be this. You might be thinking, oh, that's really kind of them. I didn't really expect it. I didn't really deserve it. So the point I'm making is a helpful thought, as it comes into your mind, can then generate a whole load of nice other thoughts. Now, and then eventually that thought at some point will go. But I think you know what's coming. The same is true with unhelpful thoughts. And remember, the same applies. You cannot stop yourself having an unhelpful thought. So you're a 16-year-old child in the beginning of May. You know you've got your GCSEs coming up. Bang, in comes an unhelpful thought. I'm going to fail. You can't stop your brain doing that. But here's the important thing. You can learn to stop feeding that thought with more and more, and pardon the phrase, but just utter rubbish that your brain starts to pull in to then make that unhelpful thought bigger and bigger and bigger, that eventually will affect your emotions. And if you keep doing that repetitively, those thoughts then start to become true. Have a guess on my caseload of children. Have a guess what % of children I'm working with that have no unhelpful thought patterns that are triggering why they are in front of me. Have a guess. 0. You're absolutely right. 100% of my patients, when you scrape through the surface, they don't know the answer, but eventually you kind of scraping through the surface, you find some kind of pillars of stone in their brain that they've latched onto, that they've built up from X number of years, and that those thoughts are true. When that red thought comes in, they believe it because they've had it for years. And so therefore, back to the little babies and back to God, I wanted to challenge you this morning, for those of you that have children or working with children or have grandchildren, is to think really carefully about, well, they're a blank canvas. So what are you doing and how are you influencing how their minds think? What are you feeding them with? And who is feeding them? Because the younger they are, the more and more their brain is that blank canvas. And eventually, so that thought starts to become true, that thought becomes a belief, and eventually, like other thoughts, they then disappear. So here's another question. You can shout out some answers. I think it's pretty obvious. And I think some of this might be true for you as well as children. When do you think this happens the most and is the most damaging? Sorry? At night. Well done. In bed. So children see this huge thing, which you and I think it's a piece of furniture to sleep. Their brains then start to realize that's where I'm going to do all my thinking. And sometimes I will see children, they can lie awake for 3 or 4 hours, sometimes more, thinking. And you find me a child that can process and learn in school that may have had 3-4 hours sleep. Forget it. It doesn't happen. So let's go back to that question then about influence, because I got a question for you. Let's pretend one of these children is your child. Or if you want all 3 of them, you can have all 3. And I want you to just think about what are the things that influence your children, your grandchildren. And I've given you some choices along the top. And here's the task I want you to do mentally. I've given you some arrows of significance, and what you've got to do is mentally put the arrows against the ones at the top. So you've got 6 categories, and you've got 6 arrows. Just think for a second, what's influencing your children? And what are they exposed to? Remember, even as 10, 12, 15-year-olds, their brains are still that canvas. Their brain is still developing. Some scientists would say between the ages of 21, 22, maybe for girls and women, up until the age of kind of mid-20s. So somewhere in that range is where the brain has fulfilled its development. Here's my fear, and again, I've worked with children for 35 years, including working in church. So in church, I've been a kind of caretaker youth pastor when we've had some gaps in our youth ministry. And I would think this is the answer for some of them. And if you are not, as parents, having some responsibility for what's on their phone and what they're accessing, you will have no clue whatsoever what is feeding their brain. And as a child psychologist, I couldn't express my concerns more strongly about some of the stuff and some of the algorithms that are part of these systems. And not only algorithms, now some of these apps, I've got my phone down there, the camera, even on the app, can now watch where your eyeballs are moving and watch specifically what you're looking at within a page. And again, that will then feed into the algorithm. So it's quite scary. And please, 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 can I strongly encourage you to take some of these questions back to your church and find people in your church. If you're not tech savvy, find people in your church that are. And really think about this as perhaps as a church. How do we protect our children? Now, so that was about what influences your children. I had the privilege, and I say that word very consciously, I had the privilege with my two brothers earlier this year to lead the whole service of the funeral of my 91-year-old father. He's a lovely man. Why do I tell you that? Him and my mother decided every single year of our childhood they're bringing us to Keswick because they believe that we should hear the word of God. These two young men sat on my left. For the very same reasons, they've been to Keswick every year of their life. Because I believe as their father, one of my responsibilities is to make sure they are fed with the truth, not some of the untruths that come online. And so I say that, so this is probably my 54th year at Keswick. And so I applaud people like James for not only for putting on events like this, but sticking true to God's word, finding ways that we can make sure that our children, and there's hundreds of them out there later on today, making sure they are soaking up God's word. So just think about that. What influence do you have? What ability do you have to make sure the children that we love and adore, that canvas and those 100 trillion connections that God is influencing them? Next door, stuck on the walls, are lots of resources that you can download, but every resource has a letter on. So if you look, so this is C. There's loads of, I've put together all kinds of YouTube clips that will help you emotionally, resources on thinking and thinking styles. So at the end of the workshop, just run next door and you can go with your camera. And again, there's two young men on my left. I'll happily help you if you've got no clue what QR codes are. So let's have a think now about anxiety. So if I work in the NHS, if all we had was £1 to invest in children's mental health, and you wanted that £1 to have the maximum impact on the most number of lives, you'd probably spend that pound on anxiety with children. Because it's the most prevalent. When you see school refusers, anxiety is the most common one. In CAMS, which is where I work, then anxiety would be the most prevalent disorder or debilitating condition that we see. And much of it stems from that thinking. Remember, if you start thinking in helpful ways, and those thoughts become a part of your belief system, then eventually your anxiety will get to levels where you will withdraw. You will think it's not safe to go to school, or I'm scared to go to school. And therefore, somehow, those of us that have the privilege of working with children need to then think, well, what can we do? And an illustration I often use with parents is if you've got a 2-year-old that's still wobbly on their feet, and you're in the park with them, and they don't like dogs, and a big dog is coming bounding over to your precious little 2-year-old, what would every parent on the planet do with that 2-year-old? Exactly. What are you doing with your 14-year-old children? You're still picking them up. You're still picking them up. So another common bit of advice I give to parents is somehow as they grow, they need to have kind of age-appropriate ways to then start dealing with that anxiety. But more importantly, giving them the tools to work it through rather than you removing the source of that danger or that fear. Do you see the difference? And I think, and I don't want to be, the last thing I want to do is be critical of parents today. I would not want to be a child today, and I certainly would not want to be a parent of a young child today. So this is not a criticism, but I just want to gently challenge you to just think, am I giving the tools to my children to prepare them for adulthood, including letting them sometimes deal with levels of anxiety, but giving them the tools to deal with that rather than you stepping in with your Superman pants on and flying in there to remove the source of that anxiety. So I'll just leave that thought with you. So let's have a think about anxiety then. So let's, first and foremost, it's normal. Anxiety is normal. If we didn't have anxiety as a human race, we'd be extinct because we'd have jumped off cliffs to try and find something to eat. But yet, for most of us, if we're stood at the edge of a cliff, our body's telling us it's dangerous, and then our body starts to become anxious. And what does that do? That makes us kind of withdraw to a point of safety. So hear me very clearly. Anxiety is not wrong and is not bad. We all have it. And it's a normal, healthy part of life. But yet, and it keeps us alert. It keeps us and it protects us from danger. But then there are levels of anxiety that once it starts creeping into our lives too much, then it will then start to become debilitating. It then starts to have that negative effect. And that's the point I want us to just think about, when should we start to be concerned and what can we do? These are some of the symptoms that sometimes we see. I'm not going to read those out. There's a QR code next door where you can download these slides, again, on your phone, or ask us if you need some help. But because then what we've also done is I produced some videos for a school on anxiety, but some of the videos, when you click them, you think, well, actually, this video is a bit childish. I wouldn't dare show this video to my 14-year-old grandson. But why not? Because even though the videos might seem a bit childish, the principles inside the videos are exactly the same, whether you're 8 years old, whether you're 14 years old, or whether you're 50 years old. And it all comes from challenging things. Now, can I just do a time check? What is the time? I didn't bring my... Sorry? 6, okay. Just excuse me a second. I should have warned the camera guys that I was going to do this. Hidden behind here, I've got a prop, which I forgot to get out earlier. So I'm really sorry. Because I want to illustrate something that is fundamentally important when we think about therapy. So, and I would like someone smaller than me, I would like to challenge someone to just ride this bike 5 or 6 meters. But I'll warn you, there's a little trick. You're going to have a go. Hey, well done. Can you give him a round of applause? So before you ride, let me just say one thing, because this is. Watch out, you lot. You got life insurance. So this is the important thing. So I'm going to assume this gentleman. Your name is John. John. I'm going to assume John has a normal and healthy brain that can understand a simple instruction. John, left is right, and right is left. Okay? So is there anything in that instruction that you don't understand?
No, there's nothing I don't understand.
Okay, so I'll stand over here, and in one go, you're going to try and ride over here. So off you go. Oh, you can sit down.
Oh, thank you.
So there's So John, just to make you feel better, no one has ever done it. And here's the science behind. I know that's a bit silly, but here's the science behind it. Those 100 trillion neurological connections, millions of them will be in John's brain. Hundreds of millions of those connections will be made. How old were you when you started riding a bike, an ordinary bike?
Maybe
7 years old. So since 7 years old, those connections were made. Here's what, as a psychologist, I find amazing. You can learn to ride a bike and then not ride it for 50 years, and your brain has remembered those connections. So those connections, those neurological connections are inside John's brain, and for some, they're a bit like a motorway, and others are like B roads and A roads. But here's the important thing. I said to John, left is right and right is left. But there's no brain on the planet can break those connections, remake some connections based on an instruction. So stop being anxious. I think you get the point, don't you? The only way, and this is a little bit more difficult the older we get, but I have the privilege of working with children where their brains are still malleable and are still flexible. But the only way a brain can do something like this is if over hours and hours and hours you break some old connections and you establish some new ones. I was sexually abused. Not me personally, but I deserved it. It was my fault. I'm rubbish. I'm useless. I'm a failure. I'm not attractive. Nobody likes me. Why do I bother? Those are that's the rhetoric I hear from children every day. And you or I saying to them, but of course you're smart. Of course you're intelligent. Then our brains just can't process that and just break. If the connection is like a motorway in your brain, nothing will just break that connection. So therefore, when we're doing therapy, then we're working with that brain to try and understand which ones are motorways, which ones are B roads, which ones are A roads, and trying therapeutically to build another framework to let their brain think about something else. And I would imagine if we gave John this bicycle, like most of us, I think it would probably take him several months before he could ride that competently. If he keeps doing it for I don't know, a year or two, chances are he'd struggle on his own bike. But that's how the brain works. So in terms of anxiety, then there are some videos that you can download that will help you. Some of them are explaining the theory behind where and how we become anxious. So there's a whole series on Mr. Worry, several videos. But then there's another video on graded exposure, where we start exposing the brain to what it's worried about. But if you do that in a structured way, gradually, those connections are broken, and then new connections are made. So let's just think, can I just do another time check? 12. So let me just whiz through some slides, because these slides, all of what I'm about to say, you can then help yourself and download information. So I'm just coming into land now, and then we're going to take some of your questions. So this is a bit of a personal slide, really, that when we're working with children, we spent a lot of time last week talking about this. Please just listen to them. If I had one wish, that let's not assume it's a spiritual, godly wish. If I just had one wish for all the children on the world today, they'd have at least one person that listens to them properly. And I don't mean just listen to them for 5 minutes. Sit down and listen to them. So if you're a grandparent and you've got time on your hands, just listen to them. Take them out for a coffee. Believe them. You don't have to agree with a child to believe them. And I think a lot of children I see have concerns about how they're feeling. And they'll often say to me, but why do you believe me and my parents don't? The parents believe, well, you're making this up. You're doing this to just get out of school. And journey with them, pray with them. Again, we've talked about how we influence and teach them. And also some children are tactile, not all are, but some children. And remember, it doesn't always have to involve words. That's another thing I say to parents often, that we have this brilliant ability, don't we, as parents, to interrogate our children. But sometimes just snuggling up on a sofa and having physical contact without there being a conversation. Sometimes children love that. But if their fear is you're going to interrogate them, they won't come and sit next to you on the sofa. We're not going to cover that one. There's a handout, download B. There's a handout for you there, which I've written just for this week, just to get you thinking, and maybe this is something for church. If you've not got prayer meetings in your church, specifically for children and youth, go back and talk to your pastor and say, look, this is what children are coping with every day. We should be praying for them. We should be asking God to guard their hearts and their minds. We should be asking God to transform their minds. So try and encourage your church to come together in prayer. And also there's another little chapter in this handout specifically about social media and the concerns about social media. So this is just a summary then of the information that you can get. So it's all to my left, stuck on the walls. And I'm also going to just put them on the floor of the stage here. I'll just lay them out when we're finished. But I think I need to stop and hand over to my colleagues to ask some questions. So thanks for listening. So,
David, thank you very much indeed. So appreciate that. We've had a bunch of questions come in. I hope that's worked well for you from that point of view. I was also incidentally very flattered to be one of the two young men over here on the left. First question, we had most connections. What can we do in schools and churches to support young people as they wait for CAMS appointments? But I suspect it's more broad than that.
Thank you. And apologies that CAMS are under severe pressure. I think my number one answer would be you can still hold that child emotionally without being an expert. So meeting up regularly with them, journeying with them through their difficulty. But here's the important thing. Making sure you listen to their concerns and not try and solve it because you might not be a professional. That can have enormous value for children rather than just feeling they're in a vacuum. So there's a myth that I could make it worse. And trust me, I've never met anyone with 2 ears who just listens and loves. I've never met anybody yet that's made it worse. And there's another myth that we're scared of children that have expressed some thoughts of suicide. Well, one of them is if they raise questions about suicide. And again, there's research talking about suicide does not make children more suicidal. But yet it's a subject that many of us as parents were a little bit scared to broach. And also there are, it's a bit of, I'm really sorry, it's a little bit of a postcode lottery. Some schools have phenomenal resources pastorally. And some schools, sadly, have almost nothing. But even then, schools that don't have much may have charities that are attached to the school. So some schools use retired mentors. That would be good. Some schools have listeners. So just check to see what the school can offer. And even social services often have connections into the local community, and they too may know of charities. But the biggest help is sitting in the room. It's you. It's just listen to them and journey with them.
David, thank you very much. Another question, I guess, heading over from that, how can we find good Christian therapists and counsellors who are experienced in dealing with anxiety and so on, resulting problems? CAMS is so limited.
Yeah. And I don't think there's an easy answer, James. I'm really sorry. Because, again, sadly, good professionals, whether Christian or not, that are working in the private world are just booked solid. And in church settings, those that are Christians that are obviously are in greater demand, they too just have long wait lists. So I'd like to be more upbeat than that, but that's the fact of the matter. So I work in, just to give you an idea of stats, I look after 25 specialist teams that serve the country, that serve England. So from eating teams to OCD to trauma. So the smallest increase in our teams pre-COVID were in the 35 to 40% increase. The biggest was 80. So overall, it was about a 45% increase. And that's just compared to pre-COVID. And yet today we get less money to serve those children than we did before COVID. So we're working in a broken system. I'm really sorry. So I'm not sure I can say more than that.
So in terms of finding others, if the main NHS routes aren't there, are there any particular agencies? The question you can pick up, I think that was, how do we find particularly Christian therapists and counsellors?
Yeah. And so through church, so churches will know of any, but even if you Google them, there's a network. So you might find someone that's 30, 40 miles away, which is impossible, but contact them and see, because there is a network. It's not a network that I'm in personally, but they will have a network of other Christian counsellors. So even just contact someone that you find on the website and say, do you know of anybody? And that network will then, hopefully come alive.
Sorry, could you just take, this is right, do you send it through the, thank you very much. Many of our, thank you so much. Do come up afterwards if you'd like to ask a question, but just to pick up on that. So another question that we had here was, I think this is maybe about parental guilt, and my son refused school and still struggled with anxiety and was diagnosed with ASD at 16. Is that because as a parent didn't help better influence and with the positive neuron connections? So I think that's the...
Just read that again for me, sorry.
It's a slight, yes, my son refused school and still struggles with anxiety and was diagnosed with ASD at 16. Yeah. Is that because as a parent, I think it's slightly a typo here, I think. Is that because as a parent we didn't help better influence or have better influences in the mix that help with positive neuron connections as a child?
I think the answer is no, because it's much more complex than that. About 40% of children with an autistic diagnosis will have clinical levels of anxiety. So they kind of come together. It's very unusual to find particularly boys that have got autism that are not anxious. And we live in a system. So not every school in the country understands autism and supports children with autism. You think when you were at school, busy corridors, smelly children, bumping into each other, queuing for lunch. There's so much of the sensory part of schools that autistic children struggle with, and that just kind of exacerbates their anxiety, really. Even in the classroom, it's better today than years ago, but not every teacher in the classroom will really understand the best ways to get the best out of children that have autism. So I think I challenge the author of that question in terms of what's the benefit of going there and looking, have I done something wrong? Because the answer's not there, really. I guess the answer is thinking forward. I've got a 16-year-old child. Then they've got a diagnosis of autism and has anxiety. It's more, well, what can you do going forward to then help the child, getting them outside a bit more, some small, perhaps, social interactions. The National Autistic Society, NAS, are brilliant. They have local groups that do all kinds of things with children and with families and with both. So I think forward than backwards, really.
Thank you. How can you spot negative thought patterns early?
Listen. Maybe some of us are tuned. But there's a depth to it, isn't there? So if you think about, oh, it's raining again today, which actually it's not. But that'll be a common phrase that we say at Keswick. You could argue that is a kind of red thought. But that type of thought, or there's evidence of that thought, is night and day different than a thought that's about who I am and what I am. And I guess the answer to the question would be to listen carefully for the latter, that I'm a failure, that nobody loves me, that I'm useless, that I'm a waste of time. And because when those thoughts start to take root, they're a bit like a weed. You have weeds in your garden and you go away for the weekend and they're twice the size. Those thoughts, I often call them weeds because they grow so quick. So the ones deeper in your psyche would be the answer.
Thank you, David. It's an interesting question from a different angle. Are we far too quick to label these days because everyone seems to have a mental health problem? Why do we always have to have a label?
There's two arguments to this, and if you go into the literature, you'll find strong arguments both ways. So there are some people who do similar jobs to me would argue we should never put a label, a diagnostic label on a child. And yet there are others that would say, actually, it's helpful. I think there's arguments for both. I really do. So have I ever, in my career, written a letter to say this child's got a personality disorder? I've never done that in my life. I've thought it hundreds of times, but there are some diagnostics that you're just thinking, is this diagnostics really going to help this child? Probably not. Let's work with their emotional regulation and do lots of other things that might come attached to a kind of a personality disorder. Whereas the flip side, I'll have written hundreds of diagnostic letters saying that you've got autism. Because I think at times, but then you walk through the journey of why are you looking at this assessment? What is it going to do for you? I'll ask the child, what happens if we say yes? What happens if we say no? So there's a whole load of stuff up front to make them think about the assessment before I then hand them their diagnosis. But the reason why I'd say both is on autism, that in hundreds of cases that I've seen, they then make parents think differently. they start to then explore and read things, that can open up doors at school. So you can get additional support at school. Most of my autistic patients have little cards to get out of a classroom, or that queue for lunch. Guess who's in an autistic friendly school? Guess who's at the first for the queue at lunch? It'll be the autistic children, or the children that suffer a bit with social anxiety, because they can get out of the classroom with their card. So there's things that we can do that sometimes professionals want to see that piece of paper from someone like myself, rather than just believing the parent. But we could spend all night talking about label versus no label. Just go to Google Scholar and type it in and you'll see what I mean.
Thank you. I think we've got time for one more before we pray. What strategies are useful when a child is in between normal anxiety and highly concerning anxious behaviours?
So the shoots are growing, but they're not at a diagnostic level. I'd start to give them the tools to deal with this themselves, that first and foremost. So we need to give our children tools for adulthood. So, and that needs to be an age-appropriate way. So if there's shoots that are starting to grow, and you're sensing as anxiety because this is the 10th time they've asked you the question, and they want to hear from you something that then pacifies them, then maybe on the 10th time you're not going to answer it. Maybe on the 10th time you have to be a bit tougher and say, well, look, but we've been here before. What do you need to do differently versus what help do you need from me? So sometimes we almost need to let our children have the impact that something's had on them, and then give them the tools to start dealing with it. And if they're not applying the tools, your job is to help reinforce the tools, then metaphorically pick the child up because the dog is there. Do you see the difference? Is that?
David, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
We could keep going on, obviously. There are many other questions here. A couple of factual logistics questions. There was the mention of the Association of Christian Counsellors. I don't know whether that was what you were going to pick up, just as a way of finding a Christian counsellors.
Oh, yes, yeah.
And then the QR code question. The answers, the resources are available to download afterwards. There's a QR code here from that point of view. David, a huge thank you for bringing so much wisdom and experience and insight today.